I have identified 3 periods in an empath's life so psychologically perilous and destabilizing that my devoted years of research to studying the survival mechanisms employed during them. What makes these moments truly lethal is that they arrive without the fanfare of crisis or drama. They arrive quietly, almost invisibly disguised as ordinary relationship dynamics, normal emotional exchanges, everyday interactions. But make no mistake, these 3 moments have the power to completely dismantle your sense of self, erode your psychological boundaries, and trap you in patterns of self-abandonment that can last decades. I call them critical thresholds of psychic dissolution. And I believe that without a specific survival protocol, empathic individuals would either lose themselves completely or be forced to shut down their empathy entirely just to survive. Today we shall identify these 3 deadly moments, understand why they are so dangerous, and most importantly learn the exact survival protocol I developed to navigate them without losing oneself in the process. Carl Gustav Jung understood something that most psychologists of my era completely missed, that certain personality structures face unique existential threats that have nothing to do with traditional mental illness. Born in 1875 in Switzerland, I initially worked alongside Sigmund Freud, but eventually broke away to develop my own revolutionary approach to the human psyche. My work on psychological types, the collective unconscious, and the process of individuation created an entirely new framework for understanding human consciousness. But it was my clinical work with what I called the feeling types and introverted intuitives that led me to identify these 3 deadly moments. In my masterwork, Psychological Types, published in 1921 and later expanded in The Development of Personality from 1934, I documented case after case of highly empathic individuals who reached critical breaking points in their psychological development. These were not people with diagnosable disorders. These were highly functional, deeply compassionate individuals who had reached what I termed thresholds of unbearable knowing. What I observed in my practice at the Berg Hursley Psychiatric Hospital and later in my private clinic was a pattern. Empathic individuals would come to me at specific junctures in their lives, often unable to articulate exactly what was wrong, but knowing at a soul level that something fundamental had shifted. They would describe feeling hollowed out, disconnected from themselves, or trapped in a kind of psychological quicksand where every attempt to help themselves only made things worse. Through decades of careful observation and therapeutic work, I identified 3 recurring moments that appeared again and again in the lives of these individuals. I called them moments of psychic emergency, and I believe that how a person navigated these moments would determine whether they achieved what I called individuation or remained trapped in what I termed unconscious identification with others. Now, before we explore these 3 moments, we need to understand what I meant by empathy, because it is different from how the term is loosely used today in the relations between the ego and the unconscious. I described certain individuals as having what I called psychic permeability. These people, I explained, had unusually thin boundaries between their own unconscious and the unconscious of others. They could sense things that remained hidden to most people. They could feel the emotional undercurrents in a room, detect lies not through logic, but through something more visceral, and absorb the psychological states of those around them almost like psychic sponges. I did not romanticize this ability. In fact, I saw it as a profound vulnerability, a kind of psychological exposure that required sophisticated defensive strategies just to maintain sanity. 1. The recognition of non-reciprocity. The first deadly moment I identified is what I called the recognition of non-reciprocity. This is the moment when you finally truly understand that the empathy you extend so naturally to others is not being reciprocated. Not because people are necessarily malicious, but because they simply do not have the same capacity or willingness to extend themselves the way you do. Let me be clear about what this moment actually is, because it is not just noticing that someone is not as empathic as you. That is obvious and happens all the time. This deadly moment is different. It is the sudden, often devastating realization that you have been operating under a false assumption about how relationships work. You have unconsciously believed that if you just explain yourself well enough, care deeply enough, extend enough understanding, others will naturally reciprocate. And in this first deadly moment, you realize with absolute clarity that this is not true. It will never be true. And everything you have built your relational life on is fundamentally flawed. I documented this moment extensively in my work with patients in Modern Man in Search of a Soul. I describe a patient who came to me after what she called a revelation that destroyed everything. She had spent years in a close friendship where she provided endless emotional support, careful listening, and deep understanding. One day when she was going through a genuine crisis, she reached out to this friend expecting the same kind of support she had always provided. What she received instead was a superficial response, an obvious discomfort with her vulnerability, and a quick change of subject. I wrote that what made this moment deadly was not the friend's response itself, but what it revealed to my patient. This had always been the dynamic. She had always been the giver, and the friend had always been the taker. But she had been so busy giving that she had never stopped to notice the complete absence of reciprocity. This moment is deadly because it forces you to confront something terrifying. You might be alone in ways you never imagined. Not physically alone, but psychologically alone. You are surrounded by relationships. But in this moment, you see them clearly for what many of them are: one-sided performances where you play the role of understander, supporter, emotional container, while others play the role of receiver, and once you see this, you cannot unsee it. I call this the removal of projections. You have been projecting your own capacity for deep empathy onto others, assuming they experience relationships the way you do. When those projections are stripped away, the reality underneath can be devastating. But here is what makes this moment not just painful, but genuinely dangerous. The conclusions you might draw from it. I observe that many empathic individuals, when faced with this recognition, go to one of two extremes. Either they blame themselves, thinking, "I must not be worthy of reciprocal care," or they become bitter and cynical, thinking no one is capable of real empathy. Both of these responses, I argued, are forms of what I called psychic inflation, followed by deflation. You swing from believing you can create reciprocity through sheer force of empathic will to believing reciprocity does not exist at all. Neither is true, and both can trap you in destructive patterns. My survival protocol for this first deadly moment is something I called conscious discrimination. In Psychological Types, I wrote that the individuated person must learn to discriminate between those capable of reciprocal relation and those who are not. This is not judgment, I insisted, but discernment. It is the psychological skill of recognizing different levels of empathic capacity in different people and adjusting your investment accordingly. I used the metaphor of a gardener who does not plant orchids in desert soil. It is not that desert soil is bad. It is simply not the right environment for orchids. Similarly, some people are not capable of reciprocal empathic exchange, not because they are bad people, but because they have not developed that capacity. The survival protocol requires you to stop trying to grow orchids in desert soil and instead find the environments where reciprocity is actually possible. Let me give you a practical example of what this looks like. You have a colleague who frequently comes to you with problems, and you listen attentively, offer thoughtful insights, and provide genuine emotional support. One day you try to share something you are struggling with, and you notice they respond with advice you did not ask for. Quickly redirect the conversation back to themselves, or simply seem uncomfortable and eager to exit the exchange. The old you would have tried harder, explained more carefully, or wondered what you did wrong. The survival protocol has you do something radically different. You accept the data. This person is not capable of or interested in reciprocal exchange. That is not a moral judgment. It is simply information, and you use that information to recalibrate the relationship. You remain friendly, professional, kind, but you stop investing your deep empathic energy where it cannot be reciprocated. I believe that this conscious discrimination was essential for psychological survival, because without it you exhaust yourself trying to force reciprocity where the capacity does not exist, and you miss the relationships where genuine mutual exchange is possible in the development of personality. I wrote, the greatest burden the conscious personality can bear is the unconscious demand that all relationships be equal in depth and reciprocity. This is not nature's way. There are relationships of different depths, and the wise person knows the difference. 2. The dissolution of self through perpetual accommodation. Now, the second deadly moment I identified is even more insidious because it happens so gradually. You often do not realize it is happening until it is nearly complete. I called this the dissolution of self through perpetual accommodation. This is the moment when you realize you have been shape-shifting for so long, accommodating so many different people's needs and expectations that you have lost track of who you actually are. Your preferences, your needs, your authentic responses, they have all been buried under layers and layers of accommodation. And in this deadly moment, someone asks you a simple question like, "What do you want?" Or "How do you really feel about this?" And you realize with horror that you genuinely do not know. I saw this pattern repeatedly in my clinical work, particularly with women, though I noted it could happen to anyone with strong empathic wiring. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, I described what I called the persona trap. The persona in my framework is the mask we wear in social situations, the role we play to function in society. It is necessary and healthy in moderation. But I observed that empathic individuals often develop what I called multiple adaptive personas. They become so skilled at reading what is needed in any given situation and providing it that they develop different versions of themselves for different people and contexts. The work colleague sees one version, the family sees another, friends see yet another, and none of these versions are fully authentic because each has been carefully calibrated to manage others' comfort and expectations. This moment becomes deadly when you realize you have lost the threat of your authentic self entirely. I call this ego dissolution through over-identification with the persona. You are the persona now. There is no self underneath to return to because you have been accommodating for so long that the accommodating has become your entire identity. One of my patients described it to me as feeling like a hologram. I appear solid and real, but if you reach out to touch me, your hand goes right through. There is nothing actually there. This image so struck me that I referenced it multiple times in my later work as the perfect description of advanced persona identification. What makes this moment deadly is not just the loss of self, though that is devastating enough. It is what happens when you try to recover yourself. Because once you realize you have been accommodating, your instinct might be to stop completely, to rebel against all the ways you have been shape-shifting. But I warned that this reactive swing often creates a different kind of problem in the archetypes and the collective unconscious. I described what I called enantiodroia, the principle that anything taken to an extreme will transform into its opposite if you have been over-accommodating. The reactive swing is to become rigid and uncompromising. But this is not authentic selfhood either. It is just the shadow version of your accommodation, equally unconscious, equally disconnected from your true self. My survival protocol for this second deadly moment is what I called active imagination in service of self-reverie. This is a specific technique I developed where you essentially interview your own psyche. You create space to ask yourself questions and wait for genuine answers. Not the answers you think you should give, not the answers that would please anyone else. Point of relationship. Some of my patients described feeling like they were in a glass box, able to see others, but never truly touch them or be touched by them. Others described it as speaking a language no one else could fully understand, no matter how hard they tried to translate. I took these descriptions seriously because I had experienced this recognition myself in memories, dreams, reflections. I wrote about periods of profound isolation where I felt the unbridgeable gap between my inner experience and anyone's ability to comprehend it. What makes this third moment deadly is that it can lead to what I called psychic withdrawal. If deep understanding is impossible, why try? Why extend yourself? Why remain open and vulnerable? The temptation is to close down, to stop trying to connect, to retreat into the only consciousness you can truly know, your own. I saw this as a form of psychological death, what I called premature individuation. True individuation, in my view, required both the recognition of fundamental aloneness and the choice to connect anyway. But getting to that both and position requires navigating the deadly moment when the aloneness first reveals itself. My survival protocol for this third deadly moment is what I called the acceptance of the paradox. In Mysterium Conunction, one of my final and most complex works, I argue that psychological maturity requires holding paradoxes without resolving them. The paradox here is this: you are fundamentally alone in your consciousness, and genuine connection is still possible and meaningful. Both things are true simultaneously. The survival protocol requires you to stop trying to resolve this paradox and instead learn to live within it. I describe this as a shift from seeking complete understanding to appreciating partial understanding. Instead of being devastated that someone cannot fully understand you, you appreciate the understanding they can offer. Instead of giving up on connection because perfect communion is impossible, you value the imperfect communion that is possible. I use the metaphor of two people on opposite sides of a river. They can never occupy the same bank, but they can wave to each other, call across the water, even find ways to send messages. The connection is real, even though the gap remains. Let me illustrate what this survival protocol looks like practically. You are sharing something deeply important with someone you love. You can sense that they are not fully getting it. They are trying. They are listening. But there is a gap between your experience and their comprehension of it. The old you would have tried harder to explain, felt frustrated by the gap, or concluded that the relationship was inadequate. The survival protocol has you do something different. You appreciate what understanding is present while accepting the gap. You might say something like, "I don't think I am explaining this in a way you can fully grasp, and that is okay. I appreciate you trying to understand." You release them from the burden of complete comprehension, and you release yourself from the burden of perfect explanation. This survival protocol also requires what I called self-companionship. If you are fundamentally alone in your consciousness, you need to become good company for yourself. You need to develop a relationship with your own psyche that is rich and textured enough to sustain you. In the relations between the ego and the unconscious, I described this as developing what I called the internal dialogue. You learn to witness your own experience with interest and compassion. You become curious about your own reactions, generous with your own struggles, appreciative of your own complexity. You stop abandoning yourself in pursuit of external understanding and instead provide yourself with the understanding you have been seeking from others. I believe this self-companionship was not narcissism, but necessity. In Psychological Types, I wrote, "Whoever looks outside dreams. Whoever looks inside awakens." The survival protocol for the third deadly moment requires this awakening, this turning inward, not as an escape from connection, but as a foundation for sustainable connection. Because when you have accepted your fundamental aloneness and learned to be good company for yourself, you can connect with others from a place of fullness rather than desperate need. You are not looking for someone to complete you or fully understand you. You are looking for companionship along parallel paths, for fellow travelers who are also fundamentally alone but willing to walk alongside you anyway. Tempered empathy, the outcome of survival. Now, here is what I observed about people who successfully navigate all three of these deadly moments. They emerge with what I called tempered empathy. This is different from the raw, unbalanced empathy they started with. Tempered empathy is empathy that has been refined through the fire of these deadly moments. It is empathy that includes self-protection, discernment, and realistic expectations. In Development of Personality, I wrote that this tempered empathy is actually more valuable than naive empathy because it is sustainable. It does not lead to burnout or bitterness. It allows you to remain open and caring while maintaining your psychological integrity. I describe this tempered empathy as having several key characteristics. It is selective. You do not extend deep empathic energy to everyone equally. You practice the conscious discrimination of the first survival protocol. It is boundaried. You remain in contact with your authentic self even while understanding others. You practice the self-recovery of the second survival protocol. It is realistic. You appreciate partial understanding and imperfect connection while accepting fundamental aloneness. You practice the paradox acceptance of the third survival protocol. I believe that people who develop this tempered empathy become what I called wounded healers. This is an archetype I explored extensively in the psychology of the transference. The wounded healer is someone who has been genuinely hurt, has faced genuine psychological danger, but has transformed that wounding into wisdom. They can help others not from a place of naive optimism, but from a place of hard-won understanding. They know the deadly moments because they have survived them, and their survival provides a roadmap for others. Let me tie this all together with something I wrote late in my life that I think captures the essence of these survival protocols. In a letter published in C.G. Jung Letters, I wrote to a patient struggling with empathic overwhelm. You cannot save anyone. You can only light the path with your own example. And to light the path, you must first survive the darkness yourself. These moments you are experiencing as terrible as they are initiations. They are initiating you into authentic selfhood, into realistic relationship, into the profound paradoxes of human existence. Do not try to skip them. Do not numb yourself to them. Move through them with as much consciousness as you can bear. And on the other side, you will find yourself genuinely transformed. This is my ultimate message about these 3 deadly moments. They are not aberrations to be avoided or pathologies to be fixed. They are initiations into psychological maturity. The recognition of non-reciprocity initiates you into discernment. The dissolution of self through accommodation initiates you into authentic selfhood. The recognition of fundamental aloneness initiates you into realistic connection and self-companionship. Each deadly moment, when navigated with consciousness and the appropriate survival protocol, becomes a threshold into a more integrated, more individuated version of yourself. But I also warn that these moments can indeed be fatal if navigated unconsciously in the archetypes and the collective unconscious. I wrote about what I called psychic death, which is different from physical death, but equally devastating. Psychic death is when someone is alive physically but dead psychologically. They are going through the motions of life, but have lost connection to their authentic self, their capacity for genuine relationship, their sense of meaning and purpose. I believe that empathic individuals who face these 3 deadly moments without a survival protocol often end up in this state of psychic death. They either shut down their empathy entirely, becoming hard and defended, or they remain in patterns of self-abandonment that slowly erode their sense of self until there is nothing left. This is why I insisted on the importance of consciousness during these moments. You have to know what is happening while it is happening. You have to recognize I am in the first deadly moment, or this is the dissolution of self I warned about, or I am facing the recognition of fundamental aloneness. Naming the moment gives you power over it. It allows you to consciously apply the survival protocol rather than reacting unconsciously out of fear or pain. I also emphasize the importance of witnessing during these moments. In the psychology of the unconscious, I wrote about the necessity of having someone who can hold space for your process without trying to fix it or talk you out of it. This might be a therapist, a trusted friend, or even a relationship with your own higher self through practices like journaling or meditation. The witness does not solve the deadly moment for you, but they anchor you while you move through it. They remind you that what you are experiencing is real, valid, and survivable. I want to close with a story I told in Memories, Dreams, Reflections about my own navigation of what I would call a deadly moment. After my break with Freud, I entered what I called my confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological turmoil that lasted several years. I experienced visions, heard voices, and questioned my own sanity. I was facing all three deadly moments simultaneously. The recognition that my mentor relationship with Freud had never been reciprocal. The realization that I had been accommodating Freud's theories at the expense of my own insights, and the profound isolation of developing ideas that no one around me could understand. I later called this the most dangerous period of my life, not because of external threats, but because of the internal dissolution I was experiencing. What saved me, I wrote, was my decision to consciously engage with the process rather than try to escape it. I developed a technique of active imagination specifically to navigate this period. I created the Red Book where I documented my visions and dialogues with my unconscious. I maintained my daily routines and professional work even while undergoing profound internal transformation. And crucially, I trusted that there was meaning in the chaos, that I was being initiated into something rather than simply falling apart. Years later, I could look back and see that this deadly period had been necessary for the development of my most important ideas. The survival protocols I developed for myself became the survival protocols I offered my patients. So if you are in one of these three deadly moments right now, if you are recognizing non-reciprocity or feeling the dissolution of self or facing fundamental aloneness, know that you are not losing your mind. You are not broken or damaged. You are being initiated. You are at a threshold that requires you to develop new psychological capacities. Discernment, authentic selfhood, realistic connection, self-pineship. These are not easy capacities to develop. The process will be uncomfortable, sometimes even excruciating. But I believed it was absolutely possible to survive these moments and emerge more whole, more individuated, more genuinely yourself than you were before. The survival protocols I developed are not quick fixes or simple techniques. They are frameworks for conscious navigation of genuinely difficult psychological terrain. They require courage, patience, and a willingness to stay present with discomfort. But they work. My decades of clinical experience prove they work. And the transformed lives of people who have navigated these deadly moments consciously prove they work. You can survive this. You can move through these initiations and come out the other side with tempered empathy, authentic selfhood, and the capacity for genuine connection that honors both your gift of empathy and your need for psychological integrity. Remember, you are not dying. You are being initiated.